the TRS Risk Specialist Truck Stop webinars that we present the second Thursday of each month. Remind you that this webinar does not qualify for state CE credit. This webinar is designed to provide information concerning certain subjects that are relevant in the insurance industry and the motor carriers industry. In this particular webinar, there might be some questions that some of you will have after or during the webinar. We have some experts who are sharing their knowledge with us, and if you would type in the chat section that you'll see on the right hand side of your screen, if you type in those questions, we will attempt to ask them either as we go along if they're relevant, or at the end if for some reason that we run out of time, because we do want to keep this program within the hour that we have committed to it. We will send you an email with those answers. If they're generic enough, we'll send an email to everybody who attended versus an individual questions that you might have. If there's some problems with your audio or other things, you can type those comments in the chat window or call our 800 number, 741-4084, and we'll try to rectify this. I don't think there's going to be a problem, but I'm sitting in Southwest Florida, and we're having a major thunderstorm right now, so we're hoping that electricity stays with us through this hour. Our subject today is trucking in Canada and the requirements of the cross-border concern. I thought about this seminar because 3 or 4 agents have asked me in the last couple months about what is needed for a trucker who crosses the border to go into Canada to meet the requirements, and what can they expect in those requirements. And so this seminar was designed for that. I reached out to a friend of mine, Chuck Snow, for TRAFFIX in Ontario, Canada, and his bio's on the next page. It's there to be downloaded. In fact, all of this webinar, for your interest, will be posted on our website, the Transportation Risk Specialist website, and you can download this presentation, the part of it. And his colleague that's with us today is Andrew Stacey, and he will also make comments in his webinars there. I'm going to ask both of them to speak about themselves, but let me tell you how I found them and why they did this. I never realized that my father influenced more people than I know of. As most of you know, we started this program for the motor carriers insurance education about 18 months ago, which required me or had me send out blogs and white papers and all that. And so I didn't know how many people I reached. I received an email over a year ago that was very informative. He asked me, "Are you Merle Ruke's son?" And I came back, yes, and I said, "Why?" And he asked me if I was in Fort Myers, Florida. And he said, "Well, back in the 60s, your father got me started in the trucking business because he had a relationship with my father. And so when we talked about trucking in Canada, it was obviously to our benefit to talk about or have someone who's actually hands-on and does it every day." Chuck, with that opening, tell me a little bit about yourself, and then we'll pass it on to Andrew when we get through.
Well, thanks a lot, Tommy. I am the founder and CEO of a company called TRAFFIX. We are Canada's oldest third-party brokerage service, freight brokerage service, as well as we run a fleet of over 50 tractors and about 150 trailers, mostly from Canada to the U.S. To Canada. And I've been doing this altogether since 1974. I started out as an owner-operator, and 5 years later, in 1979, we started TRAFFIX, which was one of the first brokerage companies in Canada. Now we are the oldest. A lot have come and gone since. And I wouldn't be where I am today, nor would my family, nor would the 100 or so people that work for TRAFFIX if it wasn't for your late father, Merle. He certainly changed an awful lot of people's lives, mine included, in my family's, and I owe that to you and your family. It's been a great run. It really has, Tommy. And I've found passion in what I do. You know, I've been coming in here for years and years and years, and I'm still as excited to come into work every day as I was the first day I started. And again, I owe that to you and your family.
Thank you for those comments. In fact, one of the things that people say repeat about me is my passion for the trucking industry, and that came again from my father, who shared the passion and obviously gave it to you and other people. And so we keep telling his story, and I appreciate those favorable comments, as I appreciate you spending your time today to put this together and your time with us today. Andrew, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, sure, and thank you for bringing me on here, Tommy. I appreciate it. I started my career many years ago back on the other side of Canada. I'm originally from Calgary. Like Chuck, I was an owner-operator. I spent most of my time traveling, between Calgary and Vancouver, doing the Rocky Mountains most of my life. I'm a second-generation trucker, and I ended up moving out here into the east, where I began doing my safety. I was an instructor back in Alberta, and I learned that I like to teach. I like to come in and help guys out. And when I did move out here with my family into the eastern side of Canada, I started up Million Mile Safety Consulting to do just that. And that's where Chuck and I met. And I've been working with Chuck for the past 8 years now, doing that, investigations on accidents and compliance, and dealing very much so with the cross-border trucking.
We appreciate you spending your time again today, and to add the expertise of hands-on doing it. Before we turn it over to you and talk about the general terms of trucking in Canada, I thought we'd clear up a couple things here. First off, for you who are not familiar with the border crossing, if you'll look at this border, and we'll talk briefly about it later, our major cities are adjacent to the Ontario and to the Quebec provinces of Canada. That takes us all the way from Maine on the far east to the middle part of Minnesota on the west. So those are where the major crossing are, because that's the population. The middle provinces are not that much of a crossing. The British Columbia is, though, because that's, again, adjacent to Washington, and that's where the West Coast freight comes across. So just when we deal with the various provisions in the provinces that you have to deal with, your insurers will be involved mainly in those three provinces, and we'll talk more detail about that. Also want to remind you that this increased when the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Association, came through, and this accelerated our trade with the northern neighbors. Part of this, and we all went through or remember and still have some arguments about the southern border, where the Mexicans and Mexican truckers, and we've all been through all those kind of things, and there's still, but the northern border opened up, and this increased a lot of traffic because of some of the restrictions and taxes for U.S. companies to deal in Canada were lessened, and the tariffs and the requirements are lessened just to open the border. As far as our industry goes, some of you might not realize this. I know that when we teach this in the programs we do, we try to remind you of this, but IFTA, we all deal with IFTA. IFTA stands for International Fuel Tax Agreement. Guess what international is? That's Canada. IRP, those are the portion tags. Those are, again, International Registration Plan. Again, the international we're referring to here is Canada. The insurance policies that we issue to our insureds include in the definition of covered territories. It's the U.S., Puerto Rico, and Canada. So in the information that we provide for mileages and purchase a license plate and insurance policies all make it seamless between the U.S. and Canadian and operations there. Some of you have gone into SAFER and you look at the inspections, and if you notice in the second inspection in SAFER now, and has been there for about 2 years, there is the U.S. domestic truckers and their inspection criteria or violations are shown in SAFER. It shows the various levels of inspections. The inspections named, and as the inspections levels that we have been through in classes, the other level 3, which is driver, level 2, which is walk around, level 1 is the full one. Again, the inspections are called the North American Standard Driver and Vehicle Inspection levels. Again, North America includes Canada. So these kind of things, and Canada is also a part of the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance. They're part of the alliance that oversees the various states' inspections and sets those things. And then SAFER reflects these inspections. My point here is that we forget a lot of times when we deal with the IFTAs and IRPs and the insurance policies and all that, it is seamless as far as those things go between the U.S. and Canada, just to remind you of those relationships that we have, as well as hopefully the fair trade area has energized the relationship between the U.S. and its northern neighbors, Canada. If a motor carrier provides services in Canada, they will be held to responsible to be operating the standards, and violation of operation standards will be noted in SAFER. Those are the Canadian operation standards, which through this program, Andrew is going to share some of those with us, and so is Andy. Chuck. But they are Canada operation standard, not U.S. Again, the tax distribution includes Canada when they fill out their report, and the fuel taxes will be distributed. Chuck and Andrew were asked to share with us what are the requirements to cross the northern border, the major difference in operation standards between the U.S. regulations and Canadian regulations, and other concerns and information that a motor carrier needs to be aware of while providing transportation services in Canada. To that end, when we look again, the U.S. and Canadian share many. Chuck, this is yours. Will you go ahead now and take over and go from there, sir?
Sure. The U.S. and Canada share many similarities, being the world's two largest trading partners. However, when it comes to the for-hire transportation industry, there are many differences. And before anyone can enter Canada from the U.S., they must present Canada Customs with a valid passport or a fast card if they have one. And the fast card is issued to carriers that are CT-PAT compliant, and that is an acronym, Certified Trade Partners Against Terrorism, and that's something that it's an association and a discipline that we adhere to in order to get across the border easily. And you need to have that identification, but a passport is mandatory even to get back into the U.S. So if you were an American trucker and for some reason you were in the bunk and got up into Canada and you didn't have a fast card and you were coming back in the U.S. would not allow you entry into the U.S. without a passport. So that is something you have to have.
Chuck,
yes.
We have some of these acronyms later in the end of the presentation for the people who are listening to us, and we'll go in a little more detail for exactly how to apply this and what those meanings are later. Your narrative was very good, Chuck, and please continue that narrative. I just want to remind them that some of these acronyms like Canadian Customs and FAST, we do have some of that detail that you sent us later in the program so we can look at actually how to comply with those things. But the idea of the requirement for needing this is very relevant and very good. So what you're saying, you not only have to be cleared by customs, but you also have to have a valid passport or this fast card when the U.S. driver is approaching the border to go across the border, correct?
That is correct. Now, anyone coming into Canada cannot have any type of a criminal record whatsoever. And since impaired driving carries a criminal conviction in Canada, anyone who's ever been convicted of a DUI offense is not allowed entry into Canada. Even if the conviction is 25 years old, the rule still applies. We've had that with some U.S. truckers that we have given loads to, and they've been stopped at the Canadian port of entry and refused entry into Canada. So
wow.
It's really important.
So it's not where we are used to the U.S. where that cycle for us goes 3 to 5 years. You're saying no matter what, it's a criminal offense then in Canada, huh?
That's right.
So that could be something. How do they verify that, Chuck?
They're on a system now. U.S. and the Canadian government started this years and years ago. They had anybody in Canada that had a criminal record. I think it was called CPAT or something.
CPIC.
Yes.
Yep.
And they had access, and it took a long time, but now they've got access to Americans as well.
Wow.
And both sides of the border, they'll check Canadians going into the U.S. for criminal records as well.
So the first thing is make sure that they do not have any of those convictions in here. Well, that's any other one, though, also besides DUI. That's the most common one that you might find in a driver in a vehicle, and that would be in a personal vehicle as well as a commercial vehicle. Obviously, other things from drug charges or other kind of charges also would impair their ability to cross the border too, correct?
That's correct. And even if they're flying in, we've, that's one of the things between our two countries. You're not allowed to visit the other country if you have any type of criminal record whatsoever.
Wow, so when I went skiing in Banff a couple of years ago, I needed to be careful about those lorries I took with me, huh?
We don't need any more of them up in Canada, Tommy. We got enough.
Well, of course, one of them was a divorce lawyer, so it helped me pay for one of those. Anyway, here's the next one. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, if you happen to travel with a pet in your truck, you got to make sure they're vaccinated and have a proof of vaccination. We've had to deal with that one before, where a driver got to the border and his dog or cat didn't have a proof of vaccination. They had to leave their animal at the border, a kennel, and that can slow things down.
I forgot something. Speaking about animal, sometimes we have ride-along guests, or we have people in the vehicle that in U.S., as you know, that you have to have authority or permission from your motor carrier to have a guest rider in your vehicle. They would meet the same requirement. I'm not talking about an animal here, which would be a guest rider, but someone else. They would have the same requirement to have a passport and no criminal records as well as a driver, correct?
You're right. And further to that, if you're going back to the U.S. from Canada, even an American, you've got to pre-register it in order to go back from Canada to the U.S. in a truck. You can't just show up in a truck going from Canada to the U.S. as a passenger. They have to know ahead of time that Tommy Ruke is going to be a passenger and have a copy of his passport or fast card before we get to the border.
So any of us who have motor carriers that have ride-on or even illegal ride-alongs, they need to be aware of that when they send them across the border, to not have something to be stopped. And you've got to remember, anytime a motor carrier gets stopped, they're hauling their customer's cargo, so this delays delivery and other things, besides just the total inconvenience of having their vehicle tied up.
And they will tie you up, especially if they do a full inspection at the border. Now, go ahead, Tom.
No, that's what I'm saying. Go ahead.
Now, some truck drivers in the U.S. carry firearms for protection. Canada has very strict gun laws. Therefore, do not even think of bringing firearms, tasers, tear gas, or any of that with you on your visit. For the most part, Canadians are fairly peaceful, so there's an excellent chance you will have no need to have any type of weapon in your truck.
How about the bears that we see on some of the channels here?
I was waiting for that after you said Banff.
and all those kind of things.
No, they're protected up there. You can't touch them. They can touch you.
So no firearms at all. So that would be another thing. Are they routinely checked? The cabs would be checked as they go through?
They know that American drivers do carry firearms, so they're more apt to check a U.S. driver's truck for firearms than they are Canadians.
And I assume if they find something like this, that they check further and might find drugs and other things that could be illegal too as they go through that, correct?
Well, they'll check for that too, but they're mostly interested with American drivers. When they're looking at a seasoned American driver, they're not that concerned about finding narcotics. It is firearms, and it's not even necessarily that the driver is going to be smuggling some in to sell. They just know that those drivers do carry guns for their own personal protection, and it's a no-no up in Canada.
Wow.
There's nobody in all of, and this is just for your interest, there's nobody in all of Canada, to my belief, that has a carry permit. There is no such thing unless you're a police officer or involved in security or military.
That's a political question that we'll have to answer another day, but if you saw some of the publicities coming out for in Georgia now and also in Texas, they have the firearms toting provisions and open there. So that's a whole different discussion of the mentality between Canadians and U.S., but that's a different question for a different day.
Yeah, but it makes, I must say, it makes great conversation at cocktail parties when somebody sees it.
I understand that part of it. Let's talk about we already talked about the provinces now, and let's talk about the major trade in those areas in the two provinces. Then again, Chuck and Andrew, that are close to have to do this.
The two provinces that have the most cross-border activity are Ontario and Quebec, because these two join the U.S. East from Maine to western Minnesota. British Columbia handles the bulk of all of the crossings coming from California, and that's where the main population is in British Columbia on the west coast. Now, oddly enough, there's about from all the major Canadian centers, it's no more than about 200 to 300 miles at the most to a U.S. border crossing. So everything is aligned to be close to the U.S. And Ontario and Quebec both have laws in effect that force all heavy trucks to have speed limiters installed that govern the trucks from exceeding over 105 kilometers per hour. Yes, that's kilometers, not miles. Don't ever get confused up here. And 105 works out to be about 63 miles an hour. Trucks from out of province are routinely checked at the truck inspection stations to make sure that speed limiters have been installed.
So again, they cannot cross the border because speed limiters are only now being discussed as a requirement to be put on our trucks, and very honestly, based on the political environment and what FMCSA is doing in their agenda, we're probably 2 or 3 years away from speed limiters to be a mandated requirement for U.S. truckers. So, but if I cross into Canada, I not only have to have the limiter, but it has to be set for 63 miles an hour. Do they check that also, Chuck?
Oh yeah, they definitely check it, and they're going to check a truck from out of the country first, because they would figure that those trucks would not be in compliance.
Okay. By the way, I just made a note that you're saying we're within 100, 200, 100, 150 miles of the border. It has nothing to do with it. They like U.S. It's warmer closer to the border. So it's a function of the weather, I think, a part of that. But anyway,
You're probably right.
Want to be that close to it. Okay.
Can I just add one little thing about that 65?
Please. 63, but go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. The 105 up here. When a vehicle does cross the border, the MTO, or the Ministry of Transportation, has the authority to ask you if, to open your door. They will plug into the ECM of the vehicle, and that is where they're going to read it. Now, if you're one of the lucky ones that gets across and they don't touch you, they can also charge you if your vehicle is caught doing an excessive speed. If you're doing 115 kilometers per hour or greater, they will just write you the ticket for not having the speed limiter, whether you do or you don't. You must make sure that the vehicle on the foot pedal and on your cruise control cannot do that in Ontario and Quebec. Once you leave, you can go ahead and do exactly what you want. There is nothing else that we know of in the U.S. or throughout Canada, but you must make sure it's done here.
Okay.
And before you arrive at any Canadian port of entry, you'll be required to present Canada Customs with customs documentation that clearly outlines what you're hauling, who the shipper is, who the receiver is, and a full declaration of where the product was manufactured. You'll also require a customs broker. A customs broker acts as a liaison between Canada Customs and the party responsible for paying any applicable import duties or taxes. You must know who the Canadian Customs broker is and contact them well ahead of the time before you arrive at the border so they can arrange for clearing your shipment at the port of entry. And Canada has been utilizing a pre-arrival clearing system for trucks entering Canada from the U.S. for about 20 years.
Will most of the time the shipper make these arrangements, or does the trucker make it? Obviously, what you're saying is that it's like everything else. A trucker is responsible for meeting these requirements if they're driving a truck going into Canada, and if this hasn't been done properly, they're going to be stopped and possibly fined or at least held up. But who actually facilitates this arrangement, and how would the trucker know that this has been complied with?
Well, what will happen is right now, the way it's presently working, the truck driver will take all of the documents and he will affix a barcode sticker with a barcode to the paper, and he will fax or email them to the custom broker.
You say the trucker does that, or the shipper?
Usually the trucker. A lot of times shippers won't even work with the truckers and let us use fax machines. So the guys have to go to a truck stop and use the fax machine there if they don't have a scanner or a fax machine in the truck.
Now, does the trucker, the motor carrier, make the relations with the Canadian Customs, or the
So
shipper?
that relationship is made between whoever is paying or whoever's responsible for the duties and import taxes or whatever. It's usually the people up in Canada, but not always. And that's their choice. There's dozens and dozens of these custom brokers on both sides of the border, Canadian and U.S. So what would happen is the customer would choose who the custom broker is. The driver would obtain their contact information, phone number, email address, fax number, and then send it off to them. And while the driver is driving, the load is going to be cleared. And when the driver gets to the port of entry, he hands the original documentation to the customs officer, who scans it with a barcode wand and gives him the green light if things are done properly.
And that has to specify the port of entry he's going to take. It's a Pacific entry, correct?
Yes, that's right. You cannot go to the wrong port or your clearance won't be valid.
We're familiar with some of this in the U.S. in our intermodal business, where it's coming from foreign country. We have a lot of freight forwarders and property brokers at those locations that make sure the customs are paid and all that kind of stuff. So it's very similar to that part of it then, is it not?
Identical.
Okay. It's just as this is road traffic, where we're basically what we're used to is either air or water traffic. Okay.
Exactly. Under the newest program, ACI, Advanced Commercial Information, the entire pre-clearance procedure will be done totally electronically, and all that the driver will be required to supply the customs agent is the clearance number for expedited clearance. He will be required to have hard copies of all documentation. Make sure that the port of entry that you've arranged to enter is the same one you actually enter. Inexperienced truck drivers can easily make the mistake of trying to enter at the wrong port of entry. In most cases, Canada Customs will have you return to the U.S. and cross at the correct crossing. And that's really confusing because Niagara Falls there's 3 ports there, but only one is really set up for trucks, and it's not called Niagara Falls. So things can get very confusing very easily.
So what you're saying is that the driver comes up there has to be fairly sophisticated as far as geographically goes, and the place he's going, and has some experience in this, or they might get caught unwittingly in a situation that will delay their delivery and have some problems.
Well, or at least take instructions and be able to deal with those instructions properly and effectively.
Okay, that
it's not, it's not rocket science, but you do have to do it right.
We'll talk about ACI here in a few minutes. Let's talk about the difference in some regulations.
Okay. Andrew, I'm going to let you take over because that's your area of expertise.
All right. Some of the biggest differences that we do have if anybody's ever come north of the border or whatever, and it's hard for us going down there quite often for the simple reason that, we do change our duty statuses. Our logbook hours are different between Canada and America. Even though the land looks the same, we run on a completely separate system with few variances that are similar. For an example, in the U.S., a driver, you may drive only a maximum of 11 hours. However, in Canada, we're allowed to go a maximum of 13 hours. When we redid ours up here back in 2007, They wanted to do it off the circadian rhythm, the cycle of the human clock, and this is what they have come out with. So in Canada, no driver can work any longer than 14 hours, and that would be a combination of your driving and your on-duty time combined.
So in the U.S., where we can drive 11 and work 14, the big difference here is in Canada they can actually drive 13, but both places say you cannot work more than 14.
That's right.
Okay.
Canadian drivers, we also work on a different cycle, and we discover a lot of problems when it comes to our drivers going into the United States. They have to keep two separate recaps going so that they can understand what they do have in the United States compared to what they have in Canada. In Canada, we run on a 70-hour, 7-day cycle, where in the United States, you primarily use a 70-hour, 8-day cycle. I mean, I know that you guys have other ones, and so do we. We have a 120 cycle, but the drivers don't use that very often up here as much as we used to. In Canada, we do have a reset rule. Ours is 36 hours, and unlike the U.S., it used to work out really good before the U.S. decided to change their 34-hour rule to be in the once a week, and the drivers could come home, take a 36-hour reset. They were good in both countries. Now we've got to watch whether our reset works in America. It works up here anytime we take 36 hours off, the way that the U.S. used to do it, and now we have to watch out as well with you guys if we're compliant with the 1 week rule. And we don't have that up here.
Yeah, that's, as needless to say, and everybody here who's part of this webinar listen to us, I'm sure is aware of all the controversy in the U.S. concerning this restart and how it impede their ability to maximize the use of their trucks, and it doesn't make any sense. And actually, we have an ATRA study that shows where actually the FMCSA discussion was flawed. For everybody who's listening, this will be discussed in some length at our annual conference in October. We'll have Dan Murray there to talk about this, and we'll also have a couple lawyers to talk about the impact of this, as well as the current president of the American Trucking Association and another trucker talk about how this stuff impacts. It's a lot of discussion on this, but you all seem to have a more reasonable amount as to what a trucker would want, and that is the restart can be done at any time, even though it's 2 hours longer. But that does make a difference, and that would make a compliance difference when you cross the border or not. Do they still keep the paper logs are checked, are they not? Do they electronic logs? You all recognize electronic log devices in Canada, as the U.S. is starting to be mandated to have them here?
Actually, I keep a very close eye on what's going on with the U.S. because with the internet, like with the free trade agreement, 90%, am I being overzealous there, Chuck, by saying probably 90% of the trucks go into the U.S. from here?
Out of Ontario, well, maybe a little bit. 75% anyways are going into the U.S.
So if you're looking, if you're looking to get into the driving world here, you're going to be going into the United States. There's no doubt about it. So, I pay, and the way I actually conduct business is I really look towards what the U.S. is doing, and I bring the Canadian companies that I work for up to U.S. standards because it meets and exceeds ours in several different ways. A lot of our standards weren't in place in the U.S. For an example, U.S. has had logbooks, oh, Lord, long before I was in driving, and but Canada didn't get them until the mid-'80s. So, you got to watch what the U.S. does, but we do use the electronic logs. We actually, Chuck has quite a few drivers that are using electronic logs, and for what I just stated, for the differences between the two countries, is the prime purpose of it. It causes a lot of stress to the driver trying to figure a driver, gets a fine. It's a $300 fine almost right away, and it could be for something very insignificant. If the driver's a little tired at night and he's doing up his logbook and he's got, regulations here that he's got to figure out, and then he's got regulations in America he's got to figure out, and, if he makes a mistake by a quarter of an hour, it could cost you $300.
But I think if I'll point at those is that if they conform to the U.S. regulations, since Canada is more, quote, liberal, and I don't mean that in any political sense, you would have met the Canada by the U.S. requirements, except for the difference in 36 and 30-hour restart.
Yeah, and you got to watch the cycle too. You got to watch your overall cycle for the,
Okay.
you know, we are 1 day less.
Well, again, you're 1 day less. Yeah, I understand that part.
Yeah.
The U.S. says 60 days and 60 hours in 7 days, or 70 hours in 8 days. So if you do the 60 hours in 7 days, then you would be within compliance up there. So it depends on that part of it.
Right.
Okay.
And that doesn't always work in your you know, in your favor when you're trying to get from city to city, right? So you just gotta be aware of them before you come up, and you know, just make sure that you are compliant. We have to make sure that we're compliant with the U.S. rules before we cross the border, and it would be the same for any U.S. truck coming back into Canada. The minute you cross the border, you're into that country. You're now on their rules.
Let me ask you this question. You mentioned the $300 fine, and I'm sure there are other fines here. Does that fine have to be paid before they go back over, or like the U.S. here, they send the motor carrier bill for those things? How exactly is that fine?
You know what? It's gonna really depend on where you get it. I can't speak for Quebec. I mean, I've had problems with Canadian drivers going into Quebec, so it depends on that officer up here. And not quoting anybody from MTO, I do believe that you would just be issued the citation here, and then you'd be given time to pay. So you could go home and basically, you know, your company or anybody would have time to pay that.
And if you don't pay, you don't come back, right?
What happens is they'll issue a warrant for you, and then if you get stopped at the border on your next trip up, you're going to end up in the Hoosgow.
I understand.
Okay, so continuing on, our off-duty times, they are the same as they are in both countries are the same. We have to have 10 hours of off-duty time. Canada allows the drivers to use a 16-hour window of elapsed time, where in America it's a 14-hour window. Now, the difference between this is, in America it says that you have to have the 10 hours of consecutive off-duty time or sleeper berth. In Canada, it's only 8 hours of consecutive. We could use the other 2 hours throughout the day. You take your 2 hours off, you know, say for breakfast, lunch, or what have you, as long as you're not doing anything with the commercial vehicle. Those other 2 hours would count against the 10 hours of off-duty time. So that's why we get a 16-hour window in comparison to the 14-hour window. And like we were saying before, drivers, you just got to make sure that you're compliant before you come and cross the border, as you're compliant before you go back into America.
All right. So again, what I hear enough already is that anybody who wants to cross the border, they need to have a primer on how to do it and make sure they got the right driver and the driver understands, or there could be some problems where the cargo would be held up because the driver is going to be held up.
You know what? Before any driver is hired, and I can speak for Chuck's company this way, they are trained specifically in both hours of service. They are trained with the Canadian hours of service, and they understand that, and they do some questionnaires behind it as well with the American hours of service.
And I have some latter data that we're going to go through, but just in some of our discussions earlier on that we have, Chuck, you mentioned that y'all are still having some of the same problems as the U.S. is in driver shortage. Will you share with us a few minutes concerning the Canadian problem with driver shortage and what you're finding that's similar to ours over here?
Well, you know, it's identical. It's carbon copy to what you're going through south of the border. You know, we have an aging labor pool, and the young people, it's not, you know, it's not the romantic job it was 40 years ago or 30 years ago. There's an awful lot of regulations. Currently it doesn't pay as much as other jobs where people can be home every night. And remember, we're also running cross-border, so you know, even a 500-mile trip, a driver leaves Toronto and he gets to Chicago and he takes his 10 hours in the bunk and then he comes home, he's away from his family. And we're not paying, part of it is we're not paying these people enough to attract them into the industry. And I don't think that, especially up here, I don't think that we've done enough to attract younger people all along, and we've created this void, a huge vacuum in between people that are leaving the industry and people that are coming in. And on top of everything else, you've got stricter laws, you've got more regulations, less opportunity with hours of service being cut going into the U.S. because of the new shutdown, where drivers have to take their shutdown periods.
The rest of the
which
recycle.
is supposed to, exactly, the recycle or the reset.
Restart. Yeah.
It's supposed to be 34 hours, but the way it's, unless you time it perfectly, it's always going to be longer.
Yeah, 40
so
hours.
Drivers are getting fed up with that. The other issue we have with truck drivers is, and more so I would think here than what you have in the U.S., we have traffic congestion in Canada in our big cities that is just, it's gotten to the point of being critical. What used to take us probably a half hour to get into Toronto from where our terminal is, rush hour, 20 years ago, is now 3 hours because they haven't built enough roads for the amount of cars. And that is, if any of the listeners out there are involved in sending trucks to Canada, you really have to keep that in mind, that where you have a distance of 100 miles, which should really take 2 hours, can take 4 or 5 hours just because of congestion within Canada.
One of the studies that Dan Murray from ATRA will be sharing with us in an annual conference is, and ATRA just did a study, the cost of congestion to the U.S. trucking economy, and I think that's well stated. One other thing, what proof of insurance, Andrew, do they need to meet? If they have an MC number with a 91X that shows the 750,000 minimum, given not holding anything hazardous, and that's in place, is that sufficient to get across the to meet the finance responsibility requirements to get into Canada?
I do believe I want to say, and I wish I would have talked to the insurance broker before that, I want to say $1 million. But then again, before you come up here, you're gonna obtain your CVOR, and that's going to be through the Ontario government. And Ontario,
say that initial again. We have it a little later, just so we refer to it.
The commercial vehicle operating registration. It's
right.
It's just your operating permit that you would obtain here in Ontario before you come in. And once you do obtain that, your insurance and everything will be divulged with the province before you're able to come up.
And you would have to send them proof of coverage, either a certificate or something from your insurance carrier?
That's correct.
Does Quebec work that same way?
I do believe everywhere in Canada you're going to be like that.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't. The only difference in Canada when it comes to insurance really is some of the provinces have what we call a no-fault insurance, and then we've got some provinces that run government insurance, like British Columbia, that still runs what it's under the ICBC, and which is government-operated insurance. And then, of course, we've got our, just our insurance companies that run right through Canada for the rest of the provinces. So again, you're not getting around up here without insurance.
Our policies are there, seamless. And I do have some stuff that we got another about 15 minutes here, that I have some of these other regulations later in the presentation that as we get them, Andrew and Chuck, we talk about it here. So let's move on to that. I do remind everybody that we do these on a monthly basis, and August 14th one will be provided by Dale Reagan of 10th Street, talking about the updates of MVRs and PSP, where there's some current changes in those things as far as the statistics go on PSP and those things, we welcome you there. But also put some material together, as you know, talking about getting across to Canada. So when the companies license the vehicles for international registration plan, they must show the province listed on the cab card they will be carried in the truck. So when they get stopped, they've got to show as part of that cab card where they paid a pro rata fee into Canada as a part of the license, correct? Or they can't get in either, right?
Yep, that's correct. You would have to prorate into the province that you're going to be traveling into, just like you would into the United States if you're crossing and using the IRP system.
So that's where I would then, as my registration form, show that, and I would do the pro rata if I had anticipated the first of the year when I buy my license plate to do it. But what happens if I go make one trip? Can they buy a trip card like you can in the U.S. to go for one trip for the international registration plan?
Yes, you can. You know, you can buy one-way fuel trip permits. You can also buy, you know, you can get it put onto your cab card for you and stuff like that very easily to get up here. If it's going to be the one and only trip that you're going to do, we do have several different plating agencies throughout Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, British Columbia, and stuff like that that would help you out with that without a problem.
But that's another check here, is that if they have not included the Canadian provinces in their registration for the IRP pro-rata tag, they would be stopped unless they buy the trip card. So that'd be another thing that the motor carrier needs to check before they send their first truck into Canada.
Yeah, make sure that you're licensed for that jurisdiction. If you're not licensed for it and you're only coming up the once, there are places that can help you with that. However, if you're going to be doing it, you know, on a timely level, you'd want to go back to your IRP and add that jurisdiction onto your cab card.
Okay, and then same thing with IFTA. You got to have a valid IFTA decal on the side. Okay.
That's correct.
All right, let's talk about the commercial motor vehicle operating registration. This is the one you were talking about that could be purchased through the MTO, which is the Transportation Department or the Ontario Commission, and that card must be with them, correct?
That's correct. It would be put into the permit book of the vehicle. Even in Ontario, we have to have one out-of-province vehicles. Need to have one when they're coming into Ontario. That's correct.
So that discussion is kind of different than one we have here. Right now, the federal regulation, FMCSA, is taking over most of the regulations between states. And once you meet those compliance, then there's not that much requirements you need to do within the state you're in, except the state you're domiciled in. What I'm hearing you say is that individual provinces of Canada actually set these regulations. You have to deal with the individual provinces versus the federal. Is that a difference?
Ontario seems to be the only one that I know of off the top of my head that still does that. It's the same thing. When, you know, this is where our home terminal is, so obviously, you know, we obtain our safety from our home province. From that point on, we can just show on our cab card the rest of the country as we see fit to go. We, you know, through the IRP and through IFTA, you know, they get their portion of the tax dollars. So we don't have to carry any other permits throughout Canada as long as they're listed on our cab cards. So Ontario is the only one that when you're coming into it, they still want you to have the CVOR.
To still have that, okay.
Yes.
And again, Chuck's already mentioned the metric system, and you point out each province has its own weight and length thing, so again, you would have to be conformed on that part of it. And if you're hauling, I assume, an overweight or over-length vehicle, you have to get special permits for that, just like we do down here?
Yes, and I just have to interject here for a sec. If you're coming into Ontario and you require a permit for over width or over weight or over length, allow plenty of time. This province works very, very slow, and it's very frustrating. So if you were to load up a load today in, let's say in Illinois, thinking you're going to get through tomorrow with a over length or over width permit, good luck.
It can take up to 72 hours at times.
Wow. We mentioned this fast. Go through this again, Chuck, on this free security trade deal that you talked about.
Okay, well, there's a program for truckers as well. It's for shippers, manufacturers, shippers, receivers, called CTPAT. And it was developed originally for the automotive industry in order to make sure that goods flowed over the border freely and were expedited at customs. And in order for a shipment to go under what we call the fast lane, the carrier has to be a CTPAT approved carrier as well as a fast carrier. The shipper and the receiver both have to be members of CTPAT and FAST. And the driver would be given, he has to be double-checked, and he's given what's called a FAST card, which is, if you fly at all, you'll see Trusted Traveler or Nexus, and it's kind of a Nexus card for drivers. And it means that the driver has undergone further background checking to make sure that it's a security clearance. It's very similar to what you have at the ports in the U.S. with the TWIC cards, but it's different because it's identical to a TWIC card, except a TWIC card is only for ports, for ocean ports, and this is for road crossings. So they do background checks and they do fingerprinting and iris scanning, and they do, they just make sure that you are who you say you are. And it makes clearance at the border much easier.
But to make this very clear, a fast card is for commercial only. You can't just use your fast card just to, arrive if you're going to go on a vacation.
Personal vehicle. Okay,
yeah.
That's very important. That's the try to secure the borders kind of mentality we all have. For you who download this information here, we did include some web pages that are accessible for to each Canadian provinces that you can go online, and if you notice there's trucking in each one of those that will tell your insurers how to comply within those various provinces to get sure that you're through that part of it. And also, as Andrew suggested, to make sure we know the commercial motor vehicle safety codes in Canada for your drivers to be educated. We also talk about the Ministry of Transportation. This is MTO government. This is proof of coverage for vehicles. I think we looked it up, Andrew, and I think it is $1 million. One of the problems you have is that the U.S., if you're an exempt hauler, meaning an agricultural hauler, cattle and all, there's no proof of coverage today in the U.S., so therefore you couldn't rely on any public filing, so you'd have to have an insurance part here, and they must carry that proof with them for the $1 million as we understand it, or they can't get across or they get stopped, correct, in that area?
Correct. Yeah, they won't sell you a permit.
Custom brokers, again, any other words here? This is the custom brokers or custom brokerage is involved in clearing the goods through, and the part here is to make sure that they're paid the tariffs that's involved in it, or if there's no tariff, it's a free tariff situation. Is that not the purpose of the custom broker?
That's right. Now, even if there's no tariff, there is a tax.
A tax.
Yes, up in Canada we have something called the HST. It's a value-added tax.
Okay.
And I think the U.S. is the only country that does not have one. So everything coming in.
Tax instead.
Yeah, but this is on product.
No, right. No, there's discussion here about going that way as a tax method. That's what I'm saying. So that again, the broker needs, the truck driver, the motor carrier needs to be aware of this to make sure that the cargo they're hauling has that pre-clearance, or they're going to be stopped. Is what we're suggesting.
And usually the truck driver himself or herself will be setting that up if the customer doesn't, and in most cases the truck driver is setting that up. He's going to take the paperwork, the bill of lading, and forward it to the custom broker.
And the thing that Andrew already talked about is the motor vehicle operating registration that Ontario provides, and this is the CVOR that you referred to a couple of times. Did you not, in this, Andrew, that you have to meet these requirements?
That's correct.
Okay, and this is basically, again, remember, the weight is in kilometers. Kilograms, excuse me. How big is a 4,500 kilogram truck? Is that an 18-wheeler, or is that like in U.S. where we use 10,001 as a pickup truck?
That's going to be your 10,000.
Okay,
it's 2.2 pounds per kilogram.
All right. This is the part of the carrier safety rating system. Again, they check that. So to operate in the Ontario, carriers must follow the law and must have the operation here for buses that include all these other acts that they're going to be enforced upon, correct? Is that what you shared with us?
That's right.
Okay. And here's how you contact to get the clearance, again, from the ministry department, and some phone numbers and addresses that you might need. And this is also, that Chuck already mentioned, the free and secure trade. This is to get a pre-clearance of your drivers. This allows them not to have to carry the passport with them. Is that not right, Chuck?
Well, there's more to it, because they have to be, you'd have to be coming up all the time, and you'd have to become a CT-PAT carrier in order to get the fast card.
Okay. So that would be only relevant for people who do this cross-boarding all the time. Not
That's right. Other than that, just a passport will do, an valid American passport.
And we go through a lot of this on the website if you're interested to download that for some more information that way. The last thing we have here is this ACE, this ACE thing. You have a couple minutes to share that as we close this in the last 2 minutes we got left. Chuck.
Well, the ACE manifest, e-manifest request form guide. The following are basic line-by-line explanations of the form used to collect information needed to create an electronic manifest. If not sure of an explanation, please call. We'll be glad to further explain or answer any of your questions. To avoid delays or problems at the border, we recommend printing clearly. For example, the difference between an S and a 5 could be the difference between a successful crossing or not. Taking an extra minute to print clearly may save hours at the border. So you need to put your company name and the name of your company and your SCAC code registered with it. SCAC code is your standard carrier alpha code. Submitted by means person to contact if more information or clarification is required. Telephone number of the person to contact. Arrival date, date of earliest arrival at U.S. border. Time, approximate time of arrival at U.S. border. United States port of arrival, location of entry into U.S. must be a U.S. port. Number of shipments with this trip. Number of individual shipments on the, on the manifest. How many shipments do I have on? It's really important. You have to know what's on your truck and trailer.
And this is there, and if there's any question about it, then they're stopped, which is, again, unlike what our DOT officers check those things, but they don't do much with it. But there's real strict requirements that what they say is in their truck and where it's going must match what's on those manifests, correct, or vice versa?
Well, this is a federal border entry into the U.S. of A. It's got to be 100%. There's no room for error here.
Actually, the way the ACE is set up, if it's not 100%, it's not going to go through, and your people or dispatchers or whoever is setting it up, they will know that it's not going to go through and that you're going to have problems at the border. For as ugly as it kind of sounds as we go through this, in all reality, when it's done properly, a driver goes to the border, he presents he presents the people at the border with one piece of paper. He may be asked for his fast card or a passport, depending on what the officer wants, and they're gone. It can be that fast getting through once all these details meet between the custom broker and the U.S. government.
So I flipped on some pages here because we are out of time. So basically what we're saying is you need to be aware of before you go to make sure you've got the right operating standards, but you also need to be aware of the DWIs, the convictions, the animals, the guns, and make sure all the paperwork's right to expedite you going through the border. If not, you're going to be held up because even though it's a free border, it's pretty restrictive as far as what's the transportation, and the people who are not used to this need the education in this area before they try this, or they're going to have their cargo held up. Is this not the bottom line to this, guys?
100%.
100%. I mean, you're right. We are we are the free border, I guess you could say, but they are still two very different countries. and I mean, you're doing international travel when you cross that little fictional line, right? So, keep that in mind.
thanks, guys. Chuck and Andrew, we really appreciate your time. I'm sure the participants here got a lot out of this, and as we go through this, we hope, Chuck and Andrew both, that you'll continue sending us information that we can share with everybody here as far as trucking in Canada. Members of the Motor Carriers Insurance Education Foundation, we appreciate you spending this hour with us. And again, Chuck and Andrew, we thank you, and for that, we're out of here.
Our pleasure.